Hello. So today we're going to be speaking to Vidya, who is the Lab Operations and Facilities Lead at LabGenius. So thank you, Vidya, for joining us today and taking the time to speak to us about your experiences of using MyAmici. We'll be primarily focusing on our HSE app today. And for those of you that are not familiar with that, the HSE stands for Health, Safety and Environment, and that's really all about keeping people safe in the workplace, especially in our environment, in a biotech environment. There's a lot more hazards that you can come across than you would in a normal work environment, and also about sort of protecting any harm to the environment which may occur as a result of the work that we do. So that's the kind of area that we're working on, we'll be talking about today. And I'm going to hand over to Vidya, and it would be great to hear, Vidya, a little introduction from you about yourself, your role at LabGenius, and how health and safety is particularly related to the role that you do, and also what you do at LabGenius as an organization.
Ali. I'm Vidya, and as Ali mentioned, I'm the Lab Operations and Facilities Lead at LabGenius. I've been with them for about 7 years now, and I started as a lab manager, a team of one, managing everything from research operations, which I say media prep, buffer prep, health and safety, putting processes in place, and everything to do with facilities, procurement, stock, etc. I still do that, but by managing a couple of people now, because we've scaled up, which is also where MyAmici started helping us, both in procurement and in managing the health and safety. And here we are 7 years after and going strong.
Fantastic. And what does LabGenius do as an organization? What's your area of
So we
research?
use machine learning and automation to produce antibody therapeutics that aim to bring drugs to the market. So it's a platform technology that we use, which is applicable to any target that we are working on because we are able to do it in a higher throughput. It reduces the time it takes. Using machine learning obviously helps in that as well.
So going back to sort of the HSE element of your role and your experience at LabGenius, what did HSE compliance look like before you adopted the MyAmici HSE module? And what was the kind of initiator, the thing that kind of got to the point where you thought, I really need to get some extra help with this? And what was the trigger really to speak to us about how we could help support you in HSE?
Sure. Before MyAmici, we, like many other smaller early stage biotechs, used Excel spreadsheets to keep track of everything. We still do a little bit, but using the HSC module has simplified that a little bit better. We use the Excel spreadsheet and another software called Quatsy, which used to be free but is paid now. Keep track of all of our orders as well. And the main trigger for us to move away from Excel sheets for ordering, etc., to a platform like Amici was how we were scaling up the number of scientists that we were supporting, and also the quantity and the different chemicals and other consumables that we were ordering regularly went up really big. Especially for chemicals, when your workflow is kind of steady and settled, you know the amount of chemicals that you are buying, you know the exact quantity and what it is that you're buying. When you're scaling up, that changes quite a bit. And also, when you're growing, the number of targets, the number of projects that you're working on changes, which means a lot more assay development, a lot more development work, which involves scientists trying out different things. So they might be buying smaller quantities of things that they use once, and then if it works, they buy more of. So there's a lot of change which we needed help with. Actually, I told you we were using Excel spreadsheets, which meant that every time we ordered, we weren't able to check if we already had cost assessment in place or any sort of assessment in place, or if we were checking, it took a lot of lab ops person's time to keep going back and checking. At that point, where we would check was when the chemicals were delivered, and we would see what hazards they indicated, and then we would check, not at the point of ordering, which was fine when we were smaller because we were still able to check at the point of delivery and talk to the scientists and not release it till every documentation was in place before we got them to start using the chemical. But it's not ideal. The ideal would be that you do that before, which is why when we started using MyAmici a few years back, and we didn't start HSE module while we implemented MyAmici, it came after when we started really scaling up with all the chemicals that we were using. And it helps in that you can have HSE approval in place before the orders are processed, which helps in the ideal where if you do not have a quality assessment in place, then you do not approve the orders. So you don't get the delivery. The scientists are not able to use it. This is not something that initially I was worried that this would delay our experiments, but our scientists have taken to the process much more effectively than I expected, which is a good thing. So all I have to do is check if a chemical has a cost assessment in place or not. And if it doesn't, a quick email to the scientist with a template and they fill it out and I approve the order. And then that's pretty much it. If the assessment is in place, obviously COSH is a little different in the sense that it's not just what, it is also how much is being used and who is using it, which means that Amici helps us there as well. Because you can see which team is ordering. So if it is a different team than the usual team that places the order, I can check with them. Are you doing the same workflow? Has something changed? And I can edit the assessment before I approve the order. So it helps them that way as well.
Fantastic. So would you say, before you had the HSE module in place, you spoke about scaling, and when you're small as an organization, you can have better oversight on what everybody's doing. But as you said, as you scale, you kind of lose that control really in a way. So would you say that one of the risks to LabGenius was that potentially scientists were purchasing hazardous substances that you might be unaware of, or that they might unconsciously be using in not the most safe way, and that's a risk you just didn't want to take, as an organization?
Yeah, that was one of the triggers as well. Because like I mentioned, we didn't have HSE module when we started using MyAmici. And as it happens in a lot of smaller companies, you're building processes, you are building workflows as you go on. So we realized in a few months that after the processes changed and the number of workflows that we were doing increased, we hadn't really done any cost assessments, but we did have a lot more new processes happening. So when we asked Amici to help us do a report, they were able to give us a list of all of the items that we purchased which had a HSE trigger. It helped us as well to see how many chemicals we had ordered, which we wouldn't have been able to process without the HSE approval in place. So that helps us make the decision easier to just implement the module soon.
Fantastic. So because it also gives you a bit of an oversight and audit really, or an inventory of your chemicals, which is really important as if you're managing HSE on site in an organisation such as yourselves, to understand all of the hazards that you have on site, and can then keep track of each one individually to make sure that documentation's in place. So you mentioned the scientists were actually quite positive about this change, which is really good to hear, because it can be challenging in a role such as health and safety to try and, as you say, get the scientists to do the health and safety first, which is the process should be. The health and safety comes first and then the experiment happens afterwards. And there is that misconception that health and safety delays things. Actually, you mentioned that things could be held at goods in. So there's, that delay there, whereas the document could have been put in place before the order and then it just happens sort of smoothly. So would you say there's been a bit of a culture change in your organization because of this module? Does it make scientists think safety first? And also, on the hierarchy of controls, substitution is one of those. We've had experience with other customers that it's given scientists information they wouldn't have otherwise had about the hazards involved, and it allows them to make, sensible choices about, is there a safer alternative, and eliminates the need for that chemical altogether.
It does. So we have the HSE approvers as our lab ops personnel. So we are trained to look at these things. Scientists, while some of them do have the training, not all of them know how to risk assess properly and do the substitutions, because they see a paper, follow a SOP that they found, and they want to duplicate it or try it in-house. So they would just order what was given in the materials and methods. They wouldn't want to change. But our local facilities sometimes can potentially use the same materials, sometimes not so much. For instance, we do not have mechanical ventilation in place in our labs, so all of the class 2 works needs to take place either in biosafety cabinets or recycling fume hoods, which means that, especially for solvents, we need to have the specific filter in place before they're able to use that item. So when we see the orders, it helps us prepare ahead of time for those workflows to be in place. As an example, recently, we needed to fix some cells before sending them to a CRO, which we never have done before, and it was going to be just the one time. But even then, you still have to be safe while you're doing it. You can't just do it on the bench and send it through. So previously, what would have happened is the scientists would have just ordered what they would have needed, done it, sent it through, and we wouldn't have known. So when they placed the order for formalin, we knew something needed to be checked. We double checked. The main culture change is planning ahead. So they put the orders through not when they need it, but sometimes weeks and months ahead of when they needed it. So I was able to get the correct filter in place. They did their experiment. We were able to store it safely and only order exactly how much we needed rather than storing it on site, which I do not like for an item like that.
Absolutely.
So it has helped quite a bit. There will always be people who don't plan ahead, but this helps lab ops in making sure that there's a sense check before the orders go through.
And as an organization, obviously you have an obligation to keep your staff safe. And, this kind of application allows you to put that extra layer in place to protect them from potential harm from these chemicals that you might not have otherwise been aware. So I think that's really, really powerful as an organization to be able to give that level of cover to your staff. So that's fantastic. And you've mentioned chemicals and how the system, how you use the system to manage your chemical hazards. Do you also use it for any sort of biological hazards or any kind of ethical human tissue, for instance? Do you use it as a filter for that?
Not so much. So we do use cell lines, and our risk assessment is such that if it's all the same category, we just add them to the same risk assessment. We don't need to do a separate one unless the risks or the mitigation steps or anything else changes. It's only the one team that uses it, even though the team has gotten bigger. So it's still easier to turn around and talk to your colleague than just rely on Amici throwing up triggers. We do use blood, for instance, to isolate PBMCs from, but we purchase them from suppliers who've done all the testing rather than purchase blood from, say, MHSB or something similar. And one of the things that I've noticed is sometimes MyAmici will throw triggers because all of its triggers comes from whatever the suppliers had their SDS. And sometimes, most times it's accurate, sometimes it's not. There have been a couple of instances where I definitely knew it should have had HSE trigger and it didn't. But the good thing is that you're able to edit those hazards so it works for you. Which has been really helpful to, again, have that sense check with lab operations team who are trained to look out for those things.
So you've kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, but maybe it'd be nice to have it kind of in one succinct kind of answer.
Mhm.
So what's the measurable impact been sort of on compliance, on time, on your team's confidence that you're keeping the organisation safer?
So is the culture that you mentioned, which previously people would just order and expect to use them immediately. And there would be, I don't want to use the word, but resentment that we were keeping them from their experiments.
Probably true.
But it's changed because from lab induction, we tell them the process has changed now. You need to plan ahead for your experiments. And it started a culture of people ordering things before they need it. And when we send them templates with all of the risk assessments and costs to fill in, they do that because they know the order wouldn't be processed, especially for items that has longer lead times, for instance. But we as a smaller company are flexible, so it's not so that we wouldn't approve any orders without having the documentation in place, but we still know the team members and we will still approve. For instance, if the item has a month lead time, then we know for sure that we're going to have the documentation in place before the item comes in, so we would approve and it would still come through. But the culture has shifted to people planning ahead, which is very good to see. And the amount of time lab operations used to spend during deliveries to check what the hazards were and make sure the database was updated has changed because we get monthly reports from Amici of all the items that triggered health and safety keywords, and we just use that to update our spreadsheet. We're also in the process of moving away from spreadsheet to combining the database into our ELN. So when people write their materials and methods, when they do their write-ups, they can see all of the hazard statements, all of the P statements, and anything else, any training notes that they need to. Compliance is one thing, but being practiced is a different thing. Some companies do the former much more than the latter. I want us to be a company where the culture is not just filing your documentation and forgetting about it. We want to be a company where people look at this documentation in their daily experiments. When someone is being trained on an SOP, they look up these training notes and see what needs to be done, and they're aware of where everything is, where it needs to be stored, how it needs to be disposed of, and how to use it safely, etc., before they go into the experiments. And connecting it to our ELN would be the best way to do it in our company, I think. So we're in the process of changing that.
And how do you think the HSE module has helped sort of facilitate that ideal that you want to achieve, or will help facilitate?
It's more at the ordering stage and planning ahead at this time. And the reports that I get is also a check of, do we have it in our database?
Sure.
So it's more in that perspective rather than a direct link to how it's being used in the lab. But for lab operations, it's still a huge help.
So you've obviously had a really good experience of our module, which is fantastic to hear. So if you were sort of talking to a lab manager at a similar organisation who were sort of maybe still in the earlier stages of their HSE management and were still managing it, via spreadsheets and not having that kind of control at the point of order, what would you tell them, and what do you wish you had done sooner in the way you manage health and safety at LabGenius?
A lot of it depends on the number of scientists they support and the individual company's workflows. Like I mentioned, when our workflow was stable and when it didn't change very much, you already know what is being purchased and how much is being used, and if you have all the documentation in place. It's when the scale up happens, it's when things change rapidly or too often, and also when your lab operations team is a team of one who's managing so many other things, and HSE is one of the things that they manage, then you don't have time to dedicate exclusively to make sure you comply with everything. And that's when it becomes easier to have additional support like this, which is very easy to implement and a great sense check before things are ordered, and like you mentioned, kind of instrumental in changing the culture, because even people who are used to ordering things and doing documentation after, if you don't have the approval, if the order never gets placed, if the documentation isn't in place, it complies by, automatically.
By default, yeah, absolutely. So would you recommend this to other lab operation leaders in your
Yes,
industry?
yeah, definitely. Caveat being, again, if you're small enough, an Excel spreadsheet would do. But when you scale up, when you grow, it is very, very useful. For us at LabGenius, safety and compliance is non-negotiable, and using MyAmici's HSE module makes it very easy and intuitive to maintain our high standards. And MyAmici HSE module has also allowed to streamline our individual lab operations processes, and also to identify and mitigate these potential risks before they happen, which is ideal for us.
That's brilliant. That's really, really good. That's a lovely statement. That kind of sums it up really nicely, and that's what we wanted to achieve from the app. So that's great.